Good evening and welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Tweedy lecture this evening. This is a biennial lecture which is run to celebrate the lives of Hilary and Robert Tweedy, and especially to celebrate their, particularly in Hilary's case, their contributions to peace. Hilda, sorry, beg your pardon, Hilda, sorry about that. Hilda, who had an interest in peace, gender and human rights, and Robert, who had a particular interest in environmental issues, and that's going to be the subject of our lecture tonight. And so I particularly want to express our welcome to the members of the Tweedy family who are here this evening as well. Now, I've heard that there's a number of vacant seats tonight because we have another very important visitor, and a number of people who are trying to get here are having difficulty moving across the city. So there may be some people who get across and come in late, and there may be some who are unable to join us, which is unfortunate. Also, by coincidence, this year we are celebrating the tercentenary of the Botany Department here in Trinity. 300 years ago, the first appointment was made in botany, which makes the chair of botany one of the oldest in the world, in fact, which is quite significant. And we've got various events on over the year to celebrate this. And as well as looking back at the last 300 years, one thing in particular we want to do is also look forward and address some of the challenges that are facing us. And some of the big challenges which are facing not only the planet but humanity are things like the impacts of climate change, how we're going to feed the ever-increasing human population, which now is just about hitting 7 billion and increasing rapidly, what we're going to do as fossil fuels dwindle, what are we going to replace them with, and how we're going to find new medicines and so forth. And these are the sorts of challenges which are faced by plant scientists and drive their research. And particularly here in the Botany Department in Trinity, we have a very active research group which is informed, and they focus on these questions. And it also, of course, informs our teaching program. But it's very fitting association to have our celebrations with the Tweedy lecture, because I think Hilary in particular would have been exercised about how these challenges would have impact on vulnerable people. And that's something that's, I think it's going to be a subject, and it relates back to the previous Tweedy lecture given by Mary Robinson as well, and the area that she's now developing quite extensively in climate justice. But also, when we try to tackle these issues, one of the things we're very concerned about is the environmental impact, how we maintain biodiversity, what's the impact of growing fossil fuels and so forth. And of course that's an area that would particularly have exercised Robert. And again, it's the area that we will be addressing in tonight's lecture. So I just want to close by just drawing your attention to two recent events we've had in our celebrations. One was the planting of a physic garden, a medicinal garden, a small garden in the east end of the campus, down near the Western Row, Pier Street corner of the campus. And it's a small garden of 70 medicinal plants. And the idea is to bring to life where some medicines come from and raise that issue of where medicines come from. Some of them are of sort of ancient interest and with very little medicinal relevance today, but some of the plants like Taxol, which is used for developing cancer drugs and so forth, from Taxus baccata, which are of great interest today. And to go with that, there's a publication on that garden. It's absolutely free, and it can be picked up from the Science Gallery, and the garden is just outside the Science Gallery, so I encourage you to get that. And the other publication, just a couple of weeks ago, is The Trees of Trinity College, which is the third edition of this book, edited by Daniel Kelly and David Jeffrey, and it's just a guide to the trees on our campus, and it explains 3 different walks through the campus, explaining the trees. It's lavishly illustrated with photographs, maps, and some original paintings, watercolours that were done for it. And this is available, it's a snip at only €5, and it's available from the library shop and also from the Science Gallery. So I would encourage you to arm yourself with both these publications, and they will certainly enhance your walks through the campus. And so now I want to introduce Jean Tweedy Walker, who's going to say a few words, and in so doing present her with these 2 little booklets.
Thank you very much. Well, the Tweedy family, which includes myself, my brother Bob, my sister Elizabeth, and Bob's wife Anne, and Elizabeth's husband Alan, and son and a couple of grandsons very glad that everybody's here. So thank you all for coming. I wanted to congratulate botany on their 300 years. That is wonderful. I have wonderful reminiscences of being a botany student here, and I had the great privilege of having Dr. David Webb as one of my professors. Now, I also took zoology, and zoology taught us all about the birds and the bees, but it was botany who taught us about the intriguing sex life of the mosses and ferns, and to this day, I can't pass a fern leaf without turning it over and see what's going on underneath. So it was wonderful. But my father was he was deeply an advocate for the environment, and he also was a wonderful gardener. He liked all plants, whether they were wild or domesticated. And on Sundays, at Sunday lunch, he would come in from the garden and he'd give my mother a report. And he'd say, well, the Tricuspidaria and the Tradescantia and the Skimmia, they're all doing very well. And of course, we three children would make up these Latin names and say that they were doing very well too. But his enthusiasm and love of gardening rubbed off. And in particular, but he also had a way with words. He loved the English language, and he came up with exotic words to us, and one of them that he really liked was bosky. Things were bosky. So great reminiscences of him also. And he introduced me to the Botanic Gardens, and he really loved the gardens there. And he would have loved that Dr. Jebb is giving this talk today. He would just be sitting here with rapt attention. So I want to thank Dr. Jebb for coming and giving us his time to give us this lecture. And to Dad and all things bosky. Thank you.
Right, well now it's finally my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Matthew Jed, the director of the Botanic Gardens in Glasnevin, the National Botanic Gardens in Glasnevin. Just to give you a very brief background to Matthew, he did his primary degree in botany in Oxford and stayed on to do his DPhil. And then after that, many scientists who are following a career after their PhD tend to lock themselves in a dingy laboratory somewhere in isolation and get on with some obscure experiments, but not Matthew. He went off to Papua New Guinea for 5 years, and that's where he ran the Christensen Research Centre in Madang, which must have been a wonderful experience. And then he returned to Ireland. He didn't return to Ireland, but he came to Ireland then after that, and he worked here in the herbarium on a research post in the herbarium in the Botany Department in Trinity. And from there, he was appointed keeper of the herbarium in the National Botanic Gardens. And then last year, he was appointed the director. And many of you will know that Matthew features regularly on national television and radio, and his punctuation is always impeccable on those occasions. I think this must inform to a certain extent the title of tonight's talk, although we did admit at the reception that he wasn't responsible for the title, so I find the title intriguing, but we will find out more. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Matthew Jebb.
Right, that doesn't seem to be working, or it is. Perfect. Good evening, everybody. Yes, as Fraser explained there, the title was presented to me as an idea, and I rose to the challenge. I thought, well, why not? It's a suitable thing. I'd enjoyed reading Lynn Truss's book, and so it seemed an appropriate thing to talk about. When we talk about the flora of Ireland, it's very important to see it set in its landscape. And the intriguing thing about the Irish landscape is it sums up an amazing history. In many ways, people look back in time and they assume at some point in the past, everything was pristine before human beings arrived and despoiled it. Well, bizarrely, Ireland's flora and its human population probably arrived at about the same time. It's not as though Ireland sat in lonely isolation for thousands, if not millions of years, suddenly to have human beings arrive on its shores. About 12,000 years ago, when the last vestiges of the Ice Age had disappeared, back came the vegetation, and back came human beings at the same time. So one could say that the landscape of Ireland has never been pristine. It has always involved human beings, the human presence. And we leave our mark in a huge way. This slide here sums up to me the very major sort of realms of the Irish biota. We have hillsides above infields here where a little bit of soil has gathered at the bottom of a slope, where tillage can occur, crops can be grown here. Cattle, sheep can be looked after in the winter months. Any flat, wet land is covered by great bogs and mires and wet places, very inhospitable to agriculture, as are the hills. So this gentle strip of land at the edges of the mountains is no doubt very much responsible for the four major provinces of Ireland, in that four major mountain ranges define the island. Without human beings, forest returns, and it's a very resilient nature that springs back. In the Burren today, one of our biggest issues is the lack of farming, the lack of overgrazing is a problem, because the forest grows back, the hazels here appear, in time ash forest will dominate, and the intriguing alpine flora that exists there today will be obliterated by the shade. But we can also see extraordinary levels of history in our bogs. This is on the shores of Loch Mask. Shan Valley Cahill is the townland, and it is an extraordinary forest. It is huge stumps of pines and a few oak trees. These are vast. These are 3 foot in diameter trees, gigantic trees. And they died where they stood about 4,500, maybe 5,000 years ago, when the climate of Ireland suddenly changed, became a great deal wetter. These forest giants literally died on their feet because the land became waterlogged, and that starvation of oxygen around their roots killed them. We also find extraordinary remnants of the activities of human beings. This is the Lurgan dugout canoe, which you can see. It's a huge log boat. It's exhibited to this day in the National Museum, and it's a remarkable sight. I can remember it from my very earliest youth, seeing this boat and being inspired by the scale of it. No doubt in those days it was too high for me to even look into. It's 50 foot long. It is a solid trunk of oak with not a single branch in it. There is no living oak tree in Ireland today of this scale. So 4,500 years ago, the trees were gigantic. And what is intriguing is this represents a facet of Ireland that demonstrates climate change is nothing new. This tree was buried underneath an enormous blanket bog around near Galway. It was chiseled out by some community of boat builders, but they never finished it. And it was only about 15 years ago that archaeologists looked at this boat and realized that it was an unfinished boat, i.e. it was filled with stones, it was sunk in the lake, and this was traditional where log boats are made in the world today. You always season your canoes underwater. The community that did all the work of felling this 50-foot log, dragging it to the lake, sinking it, and roughing it out, never returned to finish it off. Maybe they emigrated because of changing climate. So emigration is probably nothing new to Ireland. The bogs are remarkable for saving this amazing history of our flora and also our activities on this landscape. And this varies from the big to the small, from the microscopic pollen grains to features as large as that Lurgan dugout canoe. Some of the earliest botanists to visit the west of Ireland, and Edward Ludd, who was a Welsh ethnographer but also a botanist, in 1700 he was tramping across the bogs of Galway, and he spotted this remarkable heath, this heather here, with these huge bells, which the locals referred to as St. Davioch's Heath. We know it today as Daboesia because Linnaeus didn't like the Celtic arrangement of vowels, so he switched them round. So St. Davioch and Daboesia are spelt differently with the E and the O transposed. St Davios Heath to Edward Llwyd was an extraordinary discovery because only a few years, literally 6 years earlier, de Tournefort had found this exact same species in northern Spain. And this is an early insight into the remarkable distribution of these plants. Edward Llwyd was collecting vocabularies and the language of the Celts. He visited Scotland, Cornwall, Wales, Ireland, and gathered these together. But he also collected plants. And it was an insight into how the distribution of plants is sometimes bizarre. This plant in northern Spain grows in birch woodland, but in the bogs of Galway, it grows out in the open. So although exactly the same species, it has a very different approach to life in the two places. You can see the scale of these flowers, they're about 3/4 of an inch long, so it's a very impressive, large-sized heather. 1843, so again, more than 140 years later, William Makalah, a school teacher based in Roundstone, was walking across the great Brownstone Bog, and you can see the mountains of Connemara in the background there, and he chanced upon this heather growing across the heath there, right in the centre of the bog, a very small area, no more than 1 or 2 square kilometres, which he couldn't identify. Here it is in close-up. He sent the flowers off to James Mackay, who was the curator of the Trinity Botanic Gardens, who likewise couldn't put a name to it, and it was sent on to Joseph Hooker in Kew, who at that same month received the identical species from northern Spain. So an extraordinary pattern here. This was named Erica Mackiana after Mackay, who sent it on from the Trinity Botanic Gardens, and alas, William Macallah's name is not honoured in its epithet. But when we go to the Brownstone Bog today, we see some extraordinary plants muscling in. We see gunnera, we see fuchsia, and the background here, rhododendron. Now you have to understand, where have these plants come from? It's extremely important when we look at what surrounds us as scientists or as natural historians to understand what has been here the longest, what is recent. Can we tell the natives from the blow-ins? And this leads to the title of the talk, which is the classic case of the panda's main pursuit in life of eating shoots and leaves. And if you do not punctuate it correctly, you do not understand the message. So in the same way, if we don't get the grammar and the punctuation correct of what we see around us, we can be misled. And our history is littered with great errors. This is Westminster Hall in London. It's in the Houses of Parliament there, and it's an extraordinary structure built in 1393. It was begun. And the king who commissioned it, Richard II, set off for Ireland 2 years after the beginning of this construction. This roof is a hammer beam roof. It is nearly 35 foot across. It was one of the biggest roofs put up at the time, so it was a spectacular architectural achievement. And rumour always had it, theory always held that these timbers had been plundered from Ireland. Richard II came over to spend almost a year fighting the kings of Leinster and Munster up and down Ireland's shores and mountains. And it was always felt that the plunder he brought back were these massive Irish oak trees. Now in the 1920s and 30s, this roof was restored, a very lengthy and expensive business, and it was certainly defined that none of these trees, these timbers, came from Ireland. This seems to be an extraordinary mistake to have made, that legend held that these were Irish oak trees. And yet we can go to another enormous building in the south of England, Salisbury Cathedral. This is the tallest medieval structure in the whole of Europe, still standing. It was begun in 1220. This is an extraordinary length of time before Richard II came to Ireland. And yet what is amazing about Salisbury Cathedral, once they looked at the oak timbers in the roofs, they realised that they came from North Kildare. Not only that, but they were felled in spring of 1222. That's 170 years before Richard II came to Ireland. All of the oak in the roofs of Salisbury Cathedral came from North Kildare. And we know that from Queen's College up in Belfast, who have a dendrochronology of all the oaks of Ireland, and they're able to exactly date them to the spring of 1222. These roofs were built in the green. Another extraordinary feature of them is that they are all numbered with Arabic numerals, which indicates the carpenters working on this were French. So this was a building that was one of the most spectacular products of the medieval era in Europe. It was equivalent in many ways to building the space shuttle today. And they used foreign skills, materials to put together something truly amazing. Botanists, when they go to the west of Ireland, are struck by something very early on. And the Burren is a great place to have this exposed to you simply because there's almost nothing else to look at other than rocks and plants. So it's a great way of concentrating the mind. And here amongst the little limestone pavements, you discover orchids that grow in the Mediterranean and here on the west of Ireland, but nowhere else in between the two. And you also discover mountain avens, a plant from the Alps and from the Arctic Circle. It occurs in Scotland and the north of England, very high up mountains, but here in Ireland it's a sea level plant, rubbing shoulders with the Mediterranean orchid. We also have gentians from the foothills of the Alps, again found in many mountains throughout Europe, but here at sea level on the west coast of Ireland. And most bizarre of all, this plant Arctostaphylos uva ursi. This is the bearberry, and it's got a remarkable scientific name because Arctostaphylos is the Latin for bearberry, and uva ursi is the Greek for bearberry. So it's even been named 3 times. It's one better than New York. Arctostaphylos uva ursi, the bearberry. Here's a plant from the Arctic Circle. What on earth's it doing on this mild climate at the west of Ireland? And these were the questions that Robert Lloyd Prager and following him other botanists such as David Webb concentrated much of their career looking at, trying to understand how had these plants come to Ireland and put together the flora of this island. And Webb analysed it in great detail. And he looked at the distribution of plants, and he could see there's a lot of plants that cannot come further south than the most northerly parts of Scotland. They just find it too warm. It's too mild a climate down in the south. There are other plants that cannot set seed beyond this very warm area of southeastern England. And there are others that abhor the wet, acidic soils of Wales, Scotland, and Cornwall. They do not progress beyond this line. So there's a lot of plants obviously excluded for ecological reasons, good reasons that they would not be at home here. And yet there's a large number of plants, 180 odd species, that appear to stop at the Irish Sea. They haven't got across it. And this was taken up as a sort of mantra of these distributionalists, that these things probably reached the Irish Sea too late to cross it. It's the exact opposite of missing the boat, if you like, because what was happening at the time is Northern Europe was covered in a vast ice sheet. Enormous, miles of ice above our heads here, only 20,000 years ago. This involved so much water being consumed into this gigantic ice cap in the Northern Hemisphere that sea levels dropped up to 100 meters, 300 foot below their current levels. So Ireland was not an island at the time. It was fixed onto a huge mainland of Europe. But as that ice melted, so gradually Northern Europe warmed up and plants could find a hospitable home further north. And a race began, literally a race that as sea levels began to rise with the melting ice, as the ice started to clear the landscape, so there was an opportunity for plants and animals and human beings to migrate northwards. And when we look at this map here, we can see the vast scale of that ice sheet. It meant that anything reaching the island of Ireland had a race ahead of it if it was to get there in time before the Irish Sea formed. And Frank Mitchell nicknamed it the Littletonian steeplechase, and he could see these jumps, including the water jump, that prevented these 186 species that David Webb had identified as failing to cross this water jump. So this is a paradigm that we had 30 or 40 years ago. It was well fixed that we could see our flora had come from Europe via a land bridge across Britain. And yet we also had remarkable links with these alpine plants. Even 3 American species seem to have crossed the Atlantic in the footsteps or in predeceasing sort of Alcock and Brown, they literally would have blown across the Atlantic. A large number of our plants are definitely Atlantic. There's a huge number of species, including the Daboecia I showed you earlier on and the Erica maciana. These are plants at home in Spain, and they appear to have jumped across the Bay of Biscay into the western edge of Ireland, and they are not found elsewhere in Britain or Northern Europe. And then we have this remarkable aggregation of about 25 Mediterranean plants on the west coast of Ireland. Now, some of these are extraordinary demonstrations of plant distribution that pose big questions for us. This is the arbutus tree growing in Sardinia on the left and the lakes of Killarney on the right. In Sardinia, it's a shrub no more than a few meters tall that regularly gets burnt in the Mediterranean maquis vegetation. In Killarney, they're big 30, 40-foot tall trees. And one could always ask, well, where is it more at home? And this is an important point, because sometimes we kind of assume that Ireland is the last leg, the last stopping point, if you like, of the migration of these species. It is a plant which tends to flower and fruit in the middle of the winter. These flowers come out right through November to January, and the fruits that were pollinated the year before ripen at that time. It takes them 12 months to ripen. This is simply a feature of a plant that's used to a tropical climate in which there's a rainy season and a dry season. And the arbutus is simply flowering and fruiting in the middle of the wet season. After the ice left Ireland, it was a blasted landscape. The ice had literally ground Ireland into dust. It would have been extremely unpleasant, a marly, wet, waterlogged soil. And in order to understand what happens next, Professor Fraser Mitchell has put together a very elegant and simple understanding of the distribution of pollen grains, and you can date them. You can see, well, we can actually put a figure of where these tree species were distributed in Ireland at different dates in the past. So 9,500 years ago, pine is starting to make its landfall in Ireland. And look where it's coming from. Is it coming from Wales or Scotland? No, it's not. It appears to be coming from the southwest. So this work of Fraser's has indicated an extraordinary new view of things, and two remarkable facts come from it. That all of these species, as they arrive on our shores, are coming in from the south. And when we go back and look at Britain, we discover the first arrival of species like oak is likewise down in Devon and Cornwall. So it's not coming from the east, but from the south. And we see a race now. You've watched this oak that's just made landfall 9,000 years ago. After 500 years, it's only moved about 250, 300 kilometers northwards. And for the full 400 kilometers, it's taken it almost 1,000 years. So each generation of oaks of living, say, 100 years before they're starting to produce vast quantities of acorns, it's only moving about 30 kilometers or so. Now, of course, an oak tree can begin fruiting much younger, but still, this suggests a very slow and steady rate. And this would have been after a period of dramatic climatic change. Ireland changed from a glaciated tundra landscape to a warm, mild Atlantic climate, and yet the trees took a very long time to migrate up the island, which gives us pause for thought about the speed at which plants can actually move. When we look again at this map of Ireland during the last ice age, we see this huge ice cap, and we see that the tree line was way to the south. Therefore, all the forest trees we are familiar with, such as the oak and birch and so forth, were confined to the southern margins of continental Europe. And they form three distinct populations: Balkan area, Italian, and Spanish. And today we have a new insight into all of these plants, including animals and ourselves. We can look at DNA. And with this genetic knowledge, we have a fresh view of how things have worked. And one of the interesting findings that was done some years ago by Dr. Colin Kelleher was the realization that most of the oaks in Ireland are of Spanish ancestry. And we can understand that. We can see the proximity of Spain. And when we look at Fraser Mitchell's idea of the southern invasion of Ireland, we get a new insight that rather than everything coming from the east, things migrated up this Atlantic seaboard. So this was a paradigm that we need to correct. For a start, we should take off these arrows because they're very distracting. They fool us. They're punctuation that is quite unnecessary until we have a better understanding of what we're looking at. And we can see that these Mediterranean plants almost certainly made their migration up along that coastline. They're missing from Northern Europe. They were never there. If they were in places beneath the Bay of Biscay today. These Atlantic plants also form an extraordinary bridging effect. And there, that little second line I've done indicates these Lusitanian species, these plants like the Erica maciana, the Daboecia, the strawberry tree. These are plants that did not go to Britain, they crossed only to Ireland. And we've always thought of them as the exception. We've always thought of them as the remarkable bit of excitement in the Irish flora. But maybe they're just part of the norm. And we have overlooked the fact that plants did not come from the east, but actually they came probably to Ireland first and then moved into Britain and thence into the rest of Northern Europe later. But not all of them, because others would have come from Italy, the Balkans. These also migrated up, but no doubt it was a lot slower to cross the big central area of Europe in that period just after the Ice Age. The warm Atlantic climate would have been much more agreeable. So it gives us this suggestion that our oak forests, our pine martens, our pygmy shrews, and even our human being population all came up this western seaboard. And there are numerous genetic studies now which all point to this similar story. Oh, sorry, raced on a bit there. And when we look at these Arctic species, we should again have a fresher insight and not put a little arrow to say, well, this is extraordinary. These Arctic circle plants have come down to Ireland. Ireland is simply the vanguard of a population that moved further north and has now disappeared into the Arctic Circle, and it's left behind these important traces of its presence here in the island. And very recent work done at Maynooth College, literally a few weeks ago, indicates that some of these populations on mountains such as Ben Bulben are absolutely unique. They are tens of thousands of years old. They either sat on the cliffs of Ben Bulben right through the last ice age, or in some other area nearby, and they've now migrated up to these cliffs. But it is an extraordinary prospect, and one that other people have mooted may be a fact, that a plant like this saxifrage, Saxifraga nivalis, the snow saxifrage from the Alps, it doesn't occur anywhere else in Ireland or Britain other than the high cliffs of Ben Bulben. There is a possibility, therefore, that this plant sat for more than 40,000 years above an enormous ice sheet that covered the lower slopes and a huge snow cap that covered the summit of Ben Bulben. This is an extraordinary notion. People can believe it. And I was talking to somebody just earlier, and they said, well, I can believe that of a moss, but I find it very difficult to believe it of this plant. But we are on the cusp of discovering it, because all of these plants that are sitting there today are our laboratory, and there's a lot of eager young minds who need to be put to studying it. Some of these alpines, again, like I say, it is extraordinary that they could have jumped all the way from the Alps to these mountains after the Ice Age, or have they retreated here in some way? Have they retreated up these mountains? Either way, there's an extraordinary blank space between these areas, which genetic insights are now able to reveal to us. So when we go back and look at this landscape, we can see that we're looking at something that is extraordinary because it's so far back in the past. It's very difficult without good evidence. The fossils are few and far between. There are a few pollen grains at the bottom of these lakes, but as Fraser and other people who work on it would tell you, it is a lot of slog recovering these from the sediment and making sense of them. And here is another extraordinary plant, the Irish fleabane, Inula salicina. It only has ever been known around the shores of Lough Derg, and today there are 6 individuals left, 6 individual plants in one small area. And yet, Robert Lloyd Prager in the 1950s regarded it as perfectly safe. It was all around the lake at that time, and it was an abundant plant. But what was always extraordinary about this plant to students of botanical geography is the next population is in Poland. And as you go over to Siberia and all the way to Japan, there are vast quantities of it. This is the shores of a river in Siberia, and the dominant plant here is the Irish Fleabane. It is growing everywhere, but look at the soil around it. It is rocks. It is a rocky shingle bank at the edge of a river. In many ways, this is a post-glacial landscape. This is a plant that thrived in the blasted, ground-down nature of our post-glacial land. And today, it is disappearing. Here is one of the sites Inula used to grow in, and look at that thick soil that has developed. After 7,000 or 8,000 years, this soil has now become totally waterlogged. The lake no longer fluctuates as it used to because of a hydro scheme that was built in the 1940s, and the plant has simply vanished from this landscape. The soil has gone completely wrong. We need to return this landscape to a post-glacial landscape if we wanted that species to survive there, which simply means bringing in the bulldozer and ploughing everything off. Because Ireland has changed so dramatically with the presence of human beings controlling many things, altering things, that these plants are no longer finding a home here. Looking at plants as a whole is probably the best evidence that we used to rely upon. And today we can actually map how many species of plant occur in these different little 10-kilometre squares of the Irish landscape. So each of those dots there represents 100 square kilometres. And we can see some areas are extremely diverse. Numerous species are known, and others are a lot poorer. And one of the extraordinary features you can pick out is the River Shannon, Lough Neagh, this sort of area of Roscommon and Sligo, and the hinterland of some of the major cities. These are the most diverse botanically. And the reason for that is almost certainly that they're the greatest mosaics. When we go along the Shannon River, we find on the shores, the banks of the Shannon, we have eskers of limestone, we have huge bogs, and we have water meadows. Three extremely rich, botanically rich sites. And therefore, it is no wonder that we can pick out this little pattern of the river running through the Midlands. Species like foxgloves, we assume are totally at home, and we have to judge these plants. We say, is this a native plant, or has it been brought in by human beings? And we do that by two little tests that we run. The first one is, does it look as though it's growing in a native haunt, a vegetation type that is entirely natural? And then secondly, does it like growing in places where human beings have been? Does it like their middens and their compost heaps and their garden paths? And if it does, we can conclude that either it's finding a better home near human beings, or it is native elsewhere and has been accidentally introduced into Ireland. Some plants are very clear about where they're growing. This is sea kale, an extraordinary edible plant in the cabbage family, and here it is growing on the beach in Greystones. And when we look at the map of its distribution, we see it's entirely a coastal plant. And yet it's a gross feeder. It loves a huge amount of nitrogen every year. And it grows up here at the high strand mark where seaweed is thrown in the winter, which fertilizes it beautifully. So it gets this huge top dressing of nitrogen-rich weed killers every year. And other species of plant, and this is the henbane, a plant with extraordinary psychotic properties. The Vikings are always keen on popping a few seeds of this into their beer before a battle. All the better for getting into Valhalla. And yet, we look at the distribution of this, it's all over Britain, and it used to be all over the centre of Ireland. And it used to grow on what are quaintly termed manure heaps. Now, manure heaps are something that have really disappeared. Big stacks of animal manure that was then placed on the land is something that was a feature of every farmyard. And this wretched plant, wherever you go in Europe, everybody says, oh yes, no, that's a plant that came in historically. Human beings have probably moved that. And we term these plants archaeophytes, meaning they're ancient plants that came with human beings before the year 1500. We've set, if you like, scientifically this date of 1500 as the discovery of the New World in terms of shipping, that plants could suddenly be brought across the Atlantic from Africa and from Australia. All these extraordinary new plants arrived. Those we term neophytes, the new plants. So we have three divisions of plants: natives, archaeophytes, and neophytes. And it's generally supposed that archaeophytes are like commensals of human beings. They're plants that followed early agriculture. Now, when we looked at the distribution of henbane across Europe, we found wherever it lived, everyone said, well, that's an archaeophyte. The British regard it as an archaeophyte. It's a plant that's common on manure heaps. But when we look at the Irish situation, we find it on remote little islands. We find it nearly always somewhere where it's got bird guano and seaweed. So we realize, actually, it's a native here. And we shouldn't be assuming that it's a recent blow-in. It's probably a plant that's always grown around the seaweed banks of these islands. And yet the botanists in Britain have been misled. Now, there's answers to this, no doubt, that could be explored through genetics, but it's very difficult to pose what that question is as yet. So we need to reappraise almost every species in our flora in a different way. And of course, many of you will look at a plant like a poppy and say, well, that's a wild flower, isn't it? It's a native to Ireland. But here it is in its real home in the Middle East, in Turkey, in Syria, in Lebanon, is where the poppy is at home. And it infests the wheat fields there. But it was brought by the earliest farmers into Ireland. No doubt through trade or something, sacks of wheat and barley and oats arrived on the shores of Ireland. Possibly they were hand-carried here. 9,000 or so years ago, these grain crops were spreading rapidly across Europe. And these weeds all went with them because they were harvested with the crops and they went into the sacks and they were carried from place to place. So poppies have expanded their range right across, not only the old world, but into the new world, wherever grain crops were grown. And these archaeophytes present a very different picture. We can see some obvious patterns here. Look at the big cities of Belfast, Dublin, Waterford, Cork, even Limerick there. They show up as a pattern. And we can examine these in different ways. This is Dyer's Weld on the right-hand side here, Reseda. This is what would have made the clothes in Viking Dublin so vibrant, bright yellow. It's a fantastic Dyer's plant. Artemisia. This was a medicinal plant, much used for the last 1,000 years or so in Ireland. So these plants that we assume arrived more than 4 or 5 centuries ago are concentrated in the cities. And when we pick out certain of these species, and so this is a little subset of 20 or so species, and there they are, we find that they're almost exclusively confined to these hinterlands of these ports. And I've tended to term these plants of the English Pale. This was the conquering armies that arrived in these big ports. They brought their foreign agriculture to Ireland, and it involved a huge number of extraordinary plants, a mixture of medicinal plants, plants used in brewing, and weeds that couldn't be cleaned out from the crops. One I particularly love the name of is Silybum marianum. What an extraordinary name. And there is Silybum. Any child would delight at such a scientific name. Silybum is the milk thistle. And many people take milk thistle. It's an important medicinal plant. But it is left behind in the big ports today because by the time the British had disappeared from the Irish shores, that agriculture had spread across the island, these plants were not being used anymore. And so they literally got left behind in the English Pale. Even the time of the great settlements in the Midlands and up in Ulster, these plants had fallen by the wayside, quite literally, and were left behind, almost like fossils of the Viking and Norman settlements on the shores. In the background, you can see those leaves have got this white venation pattern, which gives the milk thistle its name. Other species of plants we can look at, and when we pick them out, we can see these are plants that grow in tillage areas. And even today, with our modern seed cleaning, many of these plants no longer occur as weeds of crops, but they still survive on the edges of these fields, and they still mark out very strikingly this pattern of all the big tillage areas of Leinster and Munster. So there's a lot of patterns in these plants that are very informative to us today. And here are the neophytes. What is extraordinary is there are as many species of neophyte as there are natives in Ireland. So huge numbers of species have arrived. But look how the neophytes are concentrated just on 2 big city centres, if you like, Belfast and Dublin. And yet, there is probably a plant that many people in the West and the Midlands of Ireland would regard as a native, the fuchsia, one of the most decorative plants. And when you explain to people, no, this comes from South America and is pollinated by hummingbirds, they're deeply shocked and disappointed that that is so. And it is an amazing thing. It's a classic neophyte because it could only have come across the Atlantic once links have been established right down as far as South America. And yet it has made itself perfectly at home. So it's very important that we distinguish these species in order to understand the story they're telling us. And when we look at the numbers of these arriving plants, it is very, very frightening. If we divide up the number of alien species in this country arriving, these are just plants, I'll add, for every 25 years, you can see that there appears to be no slowing down in this graph. I have to wonder how many species might become established in this country. Now, many of these so-called neophytes have not lasted very well. Huge numbers of them actually came and they've since disappeared. And therefore, this 818 simply represents the survivors of something very close to 1,000 species that at some point have formed little populations in the wild. And some are truly spectacular. This is Gunnera on Achill Island. It now dominates areas 5 to 10 hectares at a time with a 3-meter high canopy and absolutely nothing surviving in the winter, just brown leaves littering the landscape. This is Leggerosiphon Major, an aquatic waterweed from South Africa. It has filled Loch Corrib in very, very short order. In about the 5 or 6 years since it was first noted in Loch Corrib, many of the big bays now will be covered in patches of Leggerosiphon, again approaching 5 to 10 hectares in area. And this is parrot's feather, another little tiny aquatic plant that can smother ponds. So some of these plants that have come in are things that we should fear, and perhaps one that would cause me the most grief of all is the red valerian. That used to be so well behaved. It sat on walls. It took no effort to look after it. It was a problem in some ways in a garden. And yet here now, just in the last 5 or 10 years, it has got a foothold in the Burren. And it is spreading at an enormous rate and covering the limestone pavements. And yet you will see on many cycling sites and walking island sites and the Burren perfumery, the wonderful red valerian covering the pavements at certain times of the year. Why are these things suddenly changing their behavior? And the answer is a lot of things have altered. Firstly, our trade is now spectacularly large with the outside world. Huge numbers of plants are riding as passengers with materials coming from China, for example. But also something that Professor Mitchell alluded to at the beginning there is climatic change. There is no doubt that the climate has changed. We don't need to say anything about what the future predictions are going to be, but trees are opening their leaves sooner, birds are migrating sooner, they're raising their chicks earlier, insects are hatching 2 weeks earlier. Not all species, some are actually slowing down and becoming later in the year. But the speed of the change that is occurring today is 40 foot every single day. This is a spectacular thought. It's 2.5 kilometers a year, 250 kilometers a century, i.e. in 100 years, things that can find a foothold on the south coast of Ireland, such as leatherback turtles, now find themselves perfectly at home right off the shores of Donegal, for example. Things are moving at a tremendous rate, and I think people do not appreciate the speed at which this is overtaking us. 20 years ago, any lane side or laneway in North County Dublin, especially near the shores, had spectacular amounts of cow passing. This is absolutely standard on any lane. But you go back to those same sites today, and it's being taken over by Smyrnium, a different relative. It's also in the carrot family, but this is a totally different plant. We regard this as a plant that was probably introduced as a pot herb. It was something that could be eaten. The Vikings maybe brought it in. It was always very scarce in Ireland. It lived on the coast. But now it's starting to run inland in a spectacular manner, displacing cow parsley completely. Other plants appear to have behaved themselves in Ireland in a very different way to the way they go on in Britain. So this is bugloss, a little plant called an echium that grows often on building sites. And when it comes up, sometimes it comes up in vast numbers. It's a very, very rare plant in Ireland. It's extremely common in Britain. And if you go to Australia or North America where it's been introduced, it is an appalling problem in pastures. So there's always the likelihood that a plant like this that's grown here for centuries, maybe thousands of years, is suddenly going to lose the run of itself in the next few years, and something will happen to its behavior. So it brings me full circle to the point where we can look at these plants. We've got new ways of looking at them, but also the old ways are very good. In the 19th century, naturalists used to handle every single fact. They didn't rely upon databases or spreadsheets and crunch numbers and do statistics. They analysed every species for its own worth. And one of the lessons we've now learned is every single species of plant in Ireland probably has its own story to tell. Some may be similar to others, but each one may be unique at the same time, and we have to be very careful. So that narrative of how plants have got to this island and how they live here today requires very careful punctuation. It requires a very careful understanding of the sort of grammar of these species. And it is a very exciting field. And I would hope that there will be new generations of botanists who will now look upon these new tools at their disposal, ways of analysing things. There is a vast amount of work to be done out there. And all I can say is we need to get a move on before it may be too late, because some of these things, if they're gone, it's very frustrating. Maybe we shouldn't be worrying about the survival of plants that are growing elsewhere. What we should concentrate on is understanding how things got here, how they've lived here, because those can be the only answers to how we can keep them here into the future. Thank you very much.